Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into a book that, well, it caused a massive stir when it came out. It's called Sex at Dawn, and its argument is pretty simple. But whoa, is it radical. The authors basically say that almost everything we've been taught about sex, love, and especially monogamy is just plain wrong.
You know, the book starts with a question that, let's be honest, hits pretty close to home for a lot of people. Why does that initial spark, that passion, in so many long-term relationships just seem to fizzle out? And we're told, right, that it's our fault, or maybe we picked the wrong person. But what if the problem isn't us? What if the problem is the story we're all told about who we are and what we're supposed to want?
Okay, so to really get to the heart of the book's big idea, we've got to first break down what the authors call the standard narrative of human sexuality. This is, well, it's the story we all know, the one we've been told our whole lives. And you definitely know this story. It's the one that paints human sexuality as this epic battlefield. Men and women are basically just pawns, moved around by their competing genes. It's all boiled down to this kind of grim biological accounting, an evolutionary contract that we're all supposedly locked into. And it's all packaged so neatly, isn't it? The story goes like this. A man's agenda is to, spread his cheap and plentiful seed far and wide. The woman's agenda? To guard her limited, very valuable eggs and lock down a worthy provider. So he provides the resources, she provides the sexual fidelity so he can be sure, absolutely sure, the kids are his. And this, we're told, is the biological foundation for the modern nuclear family. And right here, this is where the authors say a ton of our modern anxiety comes from. See, the standard story tells us how we should feel. You should be perfectly monogamous, you should be possessive, jealousy is natural. But what if our actual deep down feelings are pulling us somewhere else entirely? That gap, that conflict between what we're told to feel and what we actually feel, that, they argue, is a massive source of unnecessary pain and suffering in our world.
So why is this standard story so sticky? Well, the authors came up with this fantastic term for it, Flintstonization. I love this. It's this habit we have of projecting our modern world onto the deep past. We picture our Stone Age ancestors living in these little suburban caves, a modern Stone Age family with Fred, Wilma, 2.5 kids, a mortgage on the cave, and all our modern ideas about sexual jealousy and gender roles. But what if that entire picture is just a cartoon? What if it's totally wrong?
And that leads us right to the book's main event. Its central, and I mean explosive, argument. This is a total rethink of where we come from sexually. All right, so here is the major plot twist. The book argues that for almost all of human history, our ancestors weren't living in these little monogamous pairs. Instead, they lived as hunter-gatherers in these incredibly egalitarian groups where survival literally depended on sharing everything: food, childcare, protection, and, they argue, this sharing also included sexual partners. Sex wasn't about ownership or a private contract. It was a social glue, something that built and reinforced the bonds that held the entire community together. Okay. Wow. That is a huge claim, right? So, where's the proof? Where's the evidence for this? Well, the authors say the clues are actually written all over our own bodies, and they're staring right at us when we look at our closest animal relatives.
So, let's look at our great ape cousins. There's a really interesting pattern here. You've got gibbons who are monogamous, but that's actually super rare in the primate world. Then you have our two closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. And guess what? They both live in large mixed-sex groups where promiscuity, having multiple partners, is just how they operate. It's the norm. And this is a detail that the standard story, well, it tends to just quietly ignore.
And this quote from the famous primatologist Frans de Waal just nails it. He says, "The chimpanzee resolves sexual issues with power. The bonobo resolves power issues with sex." See the difference? Bonobos in particular use sex constantly to make friends, to calm things down after a fight, to just create social harmony. The authors of Sex at Dawn argue that this bonobo model is a much, much better window into our own pre-agricultural past than the model of the more power-obsessed chimp.
The clues in our own bodies get even more specific, and this one's a big one. So if you look at testes size relative to body weight, human males are, well, they're not like monogamous gibbons or harem-living gorillas at all. our proportions are much more similar to promiscuous chimpanzees. So what? What does that matter? Well, it's a huge deal. Biologically speaking, large testes are a classic evolutionary sign of something called sperm competition. And that only happens in species where females are mating with multiple males in a short period of time. It's a biological giveaway.
And here's another puzzle for the standard story. Think about this. In a species that's supposed to be all about quiet, private pair bonding, why are female mating vocalizations so loud? The book has a pretty provocative answer. They argue those sounds weren't a private message for just one partner. Nope, they were an evolutionary advertisement, basically a bullhorn, to attract other males to the party and kickstart that very same sperm competition our anatomy seems to be designed for.
Okay, so if this is how our ancestors lived for hundreds of thousands of years, what in the world changed? I mean, something big must have happened to get us from that to, well, to here. The book argues that it all comes down to one single revolutionary event in human history.
And this timeline, wow, it really puts things into perspective. For something like 95% of the time we've existed as a species, we were hunter-gatherers. Agriculture and all the stuff that came with it, like private property and new social rules, it's just a tiny, tiny sliver at the very end of our evolutionary story. It's a very recent experiment. The author Jared Diamond even called it the worst mistake in the history of the human race.
Because with farming, for the first time ever, you had private property, you had land, you had livestock, things that needed to be passed down. And that created a brand new, high-stakes question. Who's the father? Who inherits the farm? And this, the book claims, is the real origin of our obsession with controlling female sexuality. It wasn't about love or biology, it was about property. It was about economics. And this shift didn't just change sex. It led to social hierarchies, a nosedive in overall health and quality of life, and the beginnings of patriarchy.
So bringing it all back to today, this radical reframing of our past has some pretty huge implications for how we look at love, sex, and relationships right now.
It really forces us to question things we just assume are natural. For example, that gut punch of jealousy. We're told that's just a core part of being human, right? A biological imperative. But what if it's not? What if it's more like a cultural ghost, a leftover anxiety about property that only got hardwired into our societies about 10,000 years ago? The book makes a strong case that it's the second one. And they make another really important distinction. This one's between being in love and just love. That intoxicating, can't eat, can't sleep rush of a new relationship, they argue that's our ancient wiring for sexual novelty firing on all cylinders. But here's the thing, that intense high is evolutionarily designed to fade, and we often mistake that temporary state for the real goal, which is that deep, stable, companionate love. And then, when the initial fire cools down, we feel like we've failed.
So in the end, Sex at Dawn doesn't really hand us a set of easy answers or a prescription for how to live. What it does is offer a different possibility. The possibility that the standard story we've been living inside is a kind of cage, a cage built from a profound misunderstanding of our own past. And the book leaves us with this final thought. If we accept that strict monogamy isn't our only natural story, it doesn't mean we have to throw away commitment. Instead, maybe it frees us up to be more honest with each other, more compassionate about our struggles, and maybe, just maybe, a whole lot more creative in how we decide to build our lives and love one another. Thanks for joining The Explainer.